Good afternoon and welcome back to History 121. I want to go ahead and continue our march through the late 20th century and talk about probably one of the most important military involvements that America will have in the third quarter of the 20th century, and that's the Vietnam War. This is going to be a war that will dominate the 60s and the front part of the 70s. It's going to divide America deeply, and it's going to create distrust and of the government. It's going to be a massive dividing line, or provide a massive dividing line in American culture during the almost 25 years that we're involved in Southeast Asia. So a little bit of a backstory about our involvement in Vietnam. Vietnam, prior to the Second World War, had been called French Indochina. It was occupied by the French as a colony, rubber colony, tropical goods, and with the onset of Japanese expansion in the late 1930s, the French will lose control, and the Japanese will occupy Vietnam, French Indochina, during the entirety of the Second World War. What's interesting about their occupation is that they'll actually keep the French government in place. The French were already had mechanisms in place for dealing with the locals. They already had good administrative networks. So the Japanese will militarily control Vietnam, while the French will legislatively control Vietnam. During this period of time, we'll see the rise of the Viet Minh as a resistance movement. The Viet Minh they're not truly totally a communist organization, but they'll be dominated by communists, especially under the lead of Ho Chi Minh. They're opposed to the Japanese, they're opposed to the French. They want Vietnamese self-rule in Vietnam, and they would prefer, or most of their members would prefer, a communist-style government. In 1947, the Viet Minh will declare war directly on the French. This is after the Second World War, and the French have been given control of their colonies again. And the Viet Minh will receive aid directly from Communist China as a means of opposing colonial European powers in Southeast Asia. Most famously for the French, we will have the siege of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, a major French outpost in the Vietnamese jungle will be placed under long-term siege by the Viet Minh, and ultimately the French will be forced to surrender. This is basically going to bring about the end of French rule in Indochina. The Geneva Accords will be negotiated to determine the status of Vietnam. They will officially end French rule, and they'll establish elections so that the Vietnamese can have their own governments. So where do we get involved? As early as 1950, the United States is sending military advisors secretly to Southeast Asia to aid the French army and to aid communist forces. This is part of what we call the domino theory. If you remember, the Truman Doctrine stated we're going to oppose communism and communist expansion where it is. We don't want to see the communists expand. Under the domino theory, which replaces the Truman Doctrine, essentially the American government believes that once you allow a country to adopt a communist government, that country has fallen, and it makes its neighbors more susceptible to adopting communist governments or facing communist revolutions as well. So the domino theory states that if we allow Vietnam to become communist, then Cambodia, Laos, Burma, Thailand all face the possibility of toppling and becoming communist countries as well. So we need to stop communist expansion in its tracks. The U.S. will refuse to recognize the Geneva Accords allowing for elections, and instead they're going to install Ngo Dinh Diem as the leader of South Vietnam. He is supported by the American government. It is theoretically a democratically friendly government. In all realities, Diem's government is a massively corrupt dictator state that is only in place because it is propped up by the United States as a means to prevent communist expansion. North Vietnam will be ruled by communists, and starting in 1960, will begin receiving military aid directly from the Soviet Union. China is often a back channel of aid from the Soviets during this period. So what we see developing here between 1950 and 1960 is kind of a bubbling up of the Cold War. We have a communist North, a democratically friendly South. We have both communists and Americans pouring aid into their respective allies. It creates a situation rife for war. As I said, Diem is seen as a dictator. He is seen as an overly oppressive authoritarian ruling South Vietnam. He is actually opposed by the majority of the population of Southeast Asia. Again, the only reason Diem is in power is because the Americans placed him in power and are backing his government. The majority of Vietnam at this period of time are actually, the citizens are actually Buddhists. And so what we have is a situation arises where the Buddhists and eventually the Buddhist monks are going to begin leading anti-Diem protests, most famously in 1963 to protest the crackdowns on the protests going on in South Vietnam. This monk will drive into the middle of the capital's one of their main intersections. He will sit down, his followers will douse him in gasoline, and he will practice self-immolation. He will set himself on fire in an act of defiance against Diem's government. It's a radical form of protest. It, however, will fuel further protests by the majority of South Vietnamese. And eventually, what we'll see in 1963 is a coup will overthrow Diem, displacing his government, and we'll see a power vacuum develop in its wake. So we have an unstable, quote unquote, democratic government being propped up by the United States, and we have a communist North that wants expansion and is being given aid to fight the onset or inset of American power in the area. Things are going to rapidly expand for American involvement in 1964. Again, prior to this, we'd propped up the government, but we didn't have troops on the ground except for probably a couple of hundred specialists who were there to train the South Vietnamese army. However, in 1964, there will be a set of incidents in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is still controversial as far as what happened. The United States Navy has a couple of ships at anchor in the Gulf. Over a series of nights, they will claim that communist North Vietnamese patrol boats will come out and attack them, shooting them up with machine guns. No major damage is done, and we can't even actually fully verify that if these events took place. There is actually conflicting evidence about whether or not any communist forces attacked American naval vessels in the Gulf. However, this is the type of incident that the American Congress needs in order to ramp up American involvement in Southeast Asia to prevent any further advance by North Vietnamese forces. Congress will pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution saying that we were attacked, therefore we have the right and ability to take hostile action in self-defense. And in 1965, the U.S. will commit troops, first Marines, and then they'll commit the United States Army as well to fight communist incursions into the South. They'll also begin Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder will culminate in 1 million tons of bombs and rockets dropped on North Vietnam over the course of 3 years. This is meant to destroy the road network, to take out North Vietnamese missile sites, military installations, and to, while potentially destroy a buildup of North Vietnamese military forces, it's mainly targeted against road networks and transportation networks. There's one big problem with attacking jungle forest networks in a poor Southeast Asian nation. We're not talking about paved roads and steel bridges. We're talking about dirt footpaths and bamboo wood bridges. We're talking about relatively primitive structures that are easy to rebuild. It's pretty hard to destroy a dirt road with a bomb. All you have to do is fill in the dirt and the road is operational again. Interruption. Got that handled. So it's very hard to bomb North Vietnamese targets because they're very easy to rebuild. Most of this bombing campaign takes place along what will become known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is a series of road networks connecting sites in North Vietnam with clandestine sites in South Vietnam. These are troop mobilization roads. These are supply routes. But again, they're not paved roads. They're not asphalt highways. We're talking about thousands of people using bicycles and to transport munitions or carrying munitions on their back. And all you have to do is, on a dirt road, is just shovel dirt back into the hole or walk around the crater. So Operation Rolling Thunder, while it sounds impressive, ultimately does very little to impede the progress of North Vietnamese incursion. As I said earlier, the North Vietnamese army is supplied by the Soviet Union. They're an actual state army. They are the actual official army of the North Vietnamese government. What we also have to deal with during this time are the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are communist rebels in South Vietnam who are supplied by the North Vietnamese and their Soviet allies. Now we have this image here of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which I mentioned was the target of a lot of the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign. As you can see, part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail goes into Laos. So it actually, to attack the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the U.S. government is forced to bomb a country that we never officially declared war on, and we never officially, until well after several decades after the war, admitted that we were officially bombing Laos. But you can see that Ho Chi Minh Trail is a well-developed set of networks that infiltrate almost the entirety of the South, including areas around Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. Approximately 100,000 Viet Cong existed in 1964 when the first American troops were deployed to South Vietnam. American intervention will cause membership in the Viet Cong to grow rapidly. This is going to be a situation where once Americans land on Vietnamese soil, we'll see South Vietnamese who are slightly communistically aligned, who don't appreciate the Diem government or who outright support communist unification. What they're going to do is they're going to rise up against American intervention. And the Viet Cong at times will act like a battlefield army, and at times the Viet Cong will also act as essentially terrorists. That's how we would claim them today in the 21st century. If you look at the insurgency in Iraq, this is I'm not going to say it's modeled after what the Viet Cong did, but in honesty, it's very similar to what the Viet Cong did. It's people dressing like the average civilian and committing terrorist acts in the middle of American camps or in South Vietnamese cities. It's digging traps and planting booby traps along trail networks. It's car bombings. It's run and shoot operations against American forces. So we have two distinct types of enemy opposing American involvement in South Vietnam. And I would say of the two, the Viet Cong are the more insidious because, as I said, you're going to face them on the battlefield as well as face them as terrorists infiltrating South Vietnamese society. In December 1965, we have 200,000 Americans on the ground in Vietnam. We also have UN forces from other nations, Great Britain, Australia, committed. And what we're going to start seeing is search and destroy operations. Instead of trying to fight a conventional type of battlefield war to reclaim lost territory, the Americans are going to set up fire bases, places of supply where they can go back to and control, and they'll go out from these defense points and using helicopters for high mobility, they will drop in and do missions where they seek out North Vietnamese or VC bases, the VC-friendly villages, supply depots, supply caches, and they will begin to destroy them when they find them. And then once the mission is complete, the Americans will withdraw to their fire base. Unfortunately, without occupying any territory or any villages that they capture, what this means is the Vietnamese will very quickly adopt a strategy of retreating from the villages as the Americans advance. The Americans will come in, they'll destroy whatever they find. They might even destroy entire villages. And then the Americans will go back to their fire base, and the Vietnamese will come back in at night and reestablish whatever they had in these locations. They'll also develop massive underground tunnel complexes as a means of hiding from the Americans. What Americans will turn to is, for the first time, really since the Second World War, or the First World War, pardon me, the American government will deploy chemical weapons in the field against their enemies in Vietnam. Vietnam is it is either a rugged mountain territory or it is a lowland jungle. It is not easy to navigate within. It is incredibly easy to hide in. And so the Americans will turn towards such items as napalm, which is a bomb filled with jellied gasoline that ignites on impact, that can burn small areas, or it can be sprayed, as in a flamethrower, from airplanes or soldiers with flamethrowers, or napalm. Not napalm, pardon me. They'll develop an item called Agent Orange. And Agent Orange is a defoliant. And so instead of burning massive areas with napalm, what you can do is go in with aircraft flying at altitude, and they'll fly over and spray Agent Orange over large swaths of the jungle. This kills plants, it kills broadleaf plants, so the trees will drop their leaves and you can actually see what's going on underneath the conventional tree canopy. It's only going to be 40 years later that we see the human cost of especially Agent Orange, in that it causes cancer and a number of other diseases in soldiers who are exposed to it. And that's something, as I said, it's going to be nearly 40 years before the American government will announce that U.S. soldiers are suffering the consequences of Agent Orange exposure. Think of the millions of Vietnamese people who were exposed to this and received no recognition from the U.S. government. American strategy in the Vietnam War is going to be shook to its core by the Tet Offensive in 1968. And in the waning months of 1967, General Westmoreland, the leader of American troops in Vietnam, will state that the end is coming into view, that American forces are doing the job that they had come there for. Things were stabilizing. We'd halted the North Vietnamese invasion, and that American goals were being met on the ground. In January 1968, during the Tet holiday, which is the Vietnamese New Year, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong will launch a surprise offensive throughout Southeast Asia, or throughout, pardon me, South Vietnam. I'm sorry for the confusion in terms. Combined forces of the NVA and the VC will attack 36 of the 44 state capitals in South Vietnam. They will attack Saigon, the national capital itself, and almost every major city in South Vietnam will be attacked and infiltrated by these combined forces. The attack is so successful that the U.S. Embassy in Saigon will eventually be seized and temporarily held by VC forces. Here we have one of the leaders of the South Vietnamese army in the flak jacket holding the pistol. He's actually seen, this was an image that was shot live on television. This is a still of him executing a captured North Vietnamese or Viet Cong soldier in the streets of Saigon. This is one of the images that rocked not just American foreign policy, but the American public's belief of what was going on in Vietnam. This is not the way we were taught that America or its allies treated prisoners. This was not something that we condoned. And to see a leader of the Vietnamese army personally executing captured soldiers truly rocked American beliefs about Vietnam to its core. So much so that the entirety of the Tet Offensive, which was beaten back, the American embassy was retaken, Saigon was cleared. It wasn't a situation where it was obvious that we had lost massive territory. We actually regained everything that had been assaulted during Tet. But with Westmoreland telling us in November that the Americans were meeting their goals, yet in January there was a massive infiltration and nearly successful attack by the communists, the American public lose confidence in what military and civil leaders had been saying about our involvement in Vietnam. Probably the most important turning point with this will be in February 1968 when CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, who I don't know if there's a modern corollary, um, Cronkite was seen as the voice of the American people. He was the one newsman that you could absolutely trust, Americans felt. He perhaps might be seen as the conscience of the American broadcast system. Yeah. On the CBS Nightly News in 1968, Walter Cronkite will look into the camera and he will say, "It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best that they could." Essentially, what Cronkite is saying is the American people believe that there is no way to achieve a military victory in South Vietnam, and the only thing that we have available to us is to negotiate a way out. And we're going to start seeing more and more people, especially young people, agree with Cronkite. The American opinion will turn against the Vietnam War so stoutly that Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, he had been Vice President under Kennedy and he was elected on his own in 1964, refuses to run for re-election in 1968. He is so closely tied to the expansion of American involvement in Vietnam that he knows that there is no way he can win the war once Cronkite and the American people have turned against him. Richard Nixon will win the election in 1968. He's a Republican. He is seen here with Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State. We will talk about other aspects of Nixon administration in another lecture. As far as Vietnam goes, in 1968, Nixon will begin the process of Vietnamization. We're going to turn the prosecution of the war over to the Vietnamese. It is a civil war. We have done the best we can, but the Vietnamese people need to fend for themselves. This continues American involvement, but on a scheduled drawdown of forces. In the meantime, Kissinger will begin secret talks in Paris with the North Vietnamese government, trying to find a way out for American forces and to come to terms about hopefully ending the war. At the same time that Nixon is doing this, he is actually opening relations with Soviet China. Nixon will be the first American president to visit communist China in the 20th century. He will negotiate détente with the Soviet Union, essentially a peace, an edgy peace, a peace with an understanding that we are not going to attack you, we are not planning to attack you, please don't plan to attack us. It's not a true, wonderful, let's get along peace, but it's a launching pad for interaction. He'll also negotiate some of the first treaties to reduce nuclear arms production between the two Cold War factions. Once Nixon is elected, we're going to start seeing a rapid drawdown in American support for the war. Nixon relied in 1968 for his election on what he called the silent majority. We've had 10, 15 years of civil rights protesters by the African American community. We have these young college kids that are protesting the Vietnam War and protesting the draft. Nixon views these as outsiders. He views these as negative actors in American society. It's the average American is his silent majority. They don't talk, they don't act up, they don't protest the war. They're the ones that support Nixon. Unfortunately, the silent majority is going to stop backing Nixon so powerfully when they start learning about American bombing campaigns and interactions in Laos and Cambodia. Additionally, we'll see support wane after the My Lai massacre. 500 men, women, and children, all civilians, none of them actually involved in the North Vietnamese or VC military complex, will be killed and their village destroyed by American military forces. And after My Lai, we're going to see an increase in the student protest movements, most famously at Kent State. And what's going to happen at Kent State is college students are going to declare a day of protest that will branch out into several days. The Republican governor of Ohio will call out the Ohio National Guard to put down what he sees as college protesters who are preventing normal action to take place on his campus. Rocks will be thrown. The Ohio National Guard will deploy tear gas against protesters. They'll throw the tear gas canisters back, and the National Guard is nervous. Here are American troops being used to quiet American college students voicing an anti-war opinion. One thing will lead to another, and a National Guard officer, will order that they fire into the crowd. This is that moment caught on camera where the Ohio National Guard fires on students, and students will be killed. American troops will draw blood on American campuses over the Vietnam War. And it's not going to be taken lightly by the college-age population of this country. Nationwide, college campuses will shut down as their student bodies protest Nixon, the war, and his actions at Kent State. This is actually a protest march at Iowa State University the week after Kent State. Campus protests will become so virulent that colleges, including Iowa State, will shut down. They will end their college terms early. We're talking Kent State happens in late May, early May, right around finals time, right around the period of time where students are getting ready for final exams anyway. And college administrators will shut down colleges early because they fear that if they keep classes going and maintain a normal schedule, that their campuses will erupt in bloodshed as well. Ultimately, Kissinger will sign Paris Accords with North Vietnam in October of 1972, agreeing to draw down American forces and to let it be a Vietnamese conflict. South Vietnam objects to these secret negotiations. South Vietnam objects to the American withdrawal because their government can't stand on its own. North Vietnam will actually release what had been secret negotiation information to the world and attempt to withdraw from the peace accords. Linebacker 2 will be another bombing campaign by the Americans to force the North Vietnamese military back to the negotiation table. And in January 1973, America will cease any and all offensive operations in Vietnam. It will sign the Paris Peace Accords, and within 2 months will withdraw the entirety of the American military from from Vietnam as a whole. Within 2 years, war will begin again in Vietnam, this time with the North Vietnamese beginning hostile actions. And really, without the backing of the United States government, there's nothing that the South Vietnamese can do to stop the communists. They will roll over the country in a very quick period of time, capturing Saigon and ruling a unified Vietnam from Hanoi under a communist government. As I said, between Kent State, the overall running of the war, the secrecy, the lies to the American public, Vietnam represents a breaking point for many people of my parents' generation as far as trusting the government goes. Veterans will come back from the war, and yes, there are some Vietnam veterans who will be called baby killers at the airport. There are some Vietnam veterans who will have urine poured on them. They will be met by protesters. They will be called baby killers. Not every veteran had this experience happen, but enough did, and they were met in such a way at home by civilians that there developed a great gap in a great divide in society between those who had supported the war and veterans, and on the other side, anti-war protesters. When the Accords were signed, when America pulled out, we were told, yes, we got all of our POWs and MIA soldiers out of Vietnam. And there will be evidence produced over the next 20 years, well into the 90s, purporting to show American POWs that were left to die in prison camps in Southeast Asia because the American government was so quick to try and get out as quickly as they could. So we'll have veterans groups and families who no longer trust the government because they feel like their loved ones were abandoned in haste in order to bring about peace and end a unpopular war. Even the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which opened in the early 1980s, is going to be a controversial aspect of the war because, as you can see in the picture here, we all know it as the Wall. It's a black granite monument listing the names of American casualties, American dead from the Vietnam War. It's called a black gash on the landscape, a jagged scar that never heals. And in many ways, perhaps it is the most appropriate symbol for the Vietnam War, because it is a wound that will not heal. It is a wound that to this day still divides Americans of that generation. There's no good answer for Vietnam. We went in to continue American foreign policy of blocking communist expansion, and the government lied to the American people in order to keep the war going. The government bombed other countries. It massacred civilians. It dropped millions of pounds of ordnance on a third world country in order to win a war that may have been unwinnable from the very start. And that sense of distrust that comes out of the Vietnam War will continue and be fed by other aspects of politics and government and governance going into the late 1960s and 1970s. We'll talk more about that next time.